Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, SAP with IK. Hope you're all doing good. So today's topic will be on the variant configuration. So let's try to understand first what is basically a variant configuration and why do we actually need it and where to implement this kind of a functionality. So here, if you look at these images, let's take a simple example of a bike or maybe a bicycle. So here we can see there are two models. One is basically a kind of a sporty look with a gear enabled, and the other one is a normal cycle without a gear. So typically, whenever we go to a store to buy a bicycle, so then the first thing that we select is, do I need a normal cycle or do I need a gear cycle? So that again depends on your preferences and also your usage. So let's assume that we go with the option of a gear cycle. So again in the gear cycle, what options do we have? So typically we will be having the gear ratio, and it depends on the number of gears on the low gear and the high gear, right? So let's say a sports cycle may have a different set of gear ratio, and a normal city ride could have a different gear ratio, and a mountain bike can have a different gear ratio. This is just an example for you to understand. And what other options do we basically choose in the cycle? So the thing that got into my mind, it could be the suspension. So do you need a hydraulic suspension, or do you need a rigid suspension, or maybe or a spring type of suspension? So we have like various options depending on the model and the make of the cycle, right? And then we have the option to choose the saddle or the seat. So it again varies from person to person, like what kind of a seat they basically prefer, and there might be few other options available from the supplier basically. So these three, like the gear, the suspension, and the saddle, it could be a very basic requirement that we typically choose while buying a cycle. And then if it comes to the standard cycle where you do not have the gear assembly fitted into it, so again we have these options like, should we go for a normal suspension, and what kind of a saddle should be preferred by the customer on that particular cycle. And another simple example would be a car or maybe a bike, so which is basically customized based on the customer requirement. So there, the company might provide you few options like what kind of seats do you need, and what kind of interiors do you need, and what kind of a transmission do you need, like the automatic, manual, or CVT, IVT. We have like various options in a particular model of a car, right? So these all could be part of the variants that are predefined by the company. But few premium brands, they basically give the option to the customer to choose what options they need, and based on their requirement they are going to manufacture or assemble the finished product. And nowadays we are also seeing these options in the motorcycles. Okay, so where the customer can just log into their website and choose what all accessories and what all options he need, and what color combination he needs, and finally you can say that this is my actual requirement, and also the pricing will be based on the customer's selections, right? So if we have to apply the same concept into SAP technically to understand the exact procedure, we are just creating multiple combinations of that particular product by providing the options of the components and also the set of operations that are actually required to manufacture the customized product. So in our standard manufacturing process or the discrete manufacturing process, we typically have like a predefined finished product, and which also has a predefined bill of materials and its operations. And if you want to go with a different variant of the same product, then we will again have a different material code for the same finished product, right? So let's say here in this example we have the suspension type as rigid, And again, we have like 4 or 5 options like 63 mm, 100 mm, 160 mm, or 180 mm. So in the typical manufacturing process in the discrete industry, we basically create 4 different finished products for each of these uh, variant or a size. Okay, but in case of a variant configuration, you are basically going to create one material code or one finished product, and then you're going to provide these 4 options as a variant, so that based on the customer selection, you're going to pick the exact required component and then put it into the assembly process, right? So that is how the variant configuration basically works. And now let's see the procedure and the steps to be performed in SAP to enable a variant configuration uh, scenario. So in this slide, we can see the sequential transactions and also the steps that are to be performed in order to enable the variant configuration setup. So the first one is to create the material master for the finished product with the material type as KMAT. So whenever you are going to create a product that should be part of a variant configuration, you should always have the material type as KMAT. And then we are going to create a class with the class type 300. So 300 is basically the class type for variants. And then we are going to create characteristics and then assign the values for those characteristics. So in our example, the characteristics here would be, let's say, the saddle. So the saddle is going to be a characteristic, and the types of saddles or seats, those would be the values in the characteristics. So we'll try to discuss that in more detail once we get into the SAP system and the further slides. So once we create this characteristic and assign the values, and again in the CL02, we are going to assign these characteristics to this particular class 300. So once the class and the characteristic combinations are assigned, you're going to assign this class to the material master, which is the KMAT material in the transaction MM02. So this is one set of master data related to the material and the class and characteristics. And then we have the dependency creations. So these dependencies, we are going to create that in CU01. And here we are going to define a particular code saying that if we select this particular variant of of a particular component, then only component should be picked. Okay, so that we will discuss in detail further. And once the dependencies are maintained and then we assign the values in the dependency editor, we go to the creation of a super BOM. So what is a super BOM? A super BOM basically consists of all the components that are required to manufacture a particular product, irrespective of the variant. Okay, so let's say in this case, if I go to previous slide, so here we have the gear cycle and the non-gear cycle. Okay, so the super BOM that we are going to create for the cycle, that is going to hold all the components required for both these variants, the gear and the non-gear. Okay, so that is basically called as a super BOM. And then in the super BOM, we define, since we have already defined the components, we are going to assign these dependencies that we have created earlier for each of the components. And then we are going to say that if you pick this particular cycle, then only component should be picked by the configuration program. In the same way, we are going to create a super routing. So super routing is similar to the super BOM, but here this is a routing where you basically define the complete set of operations that you need to manufacture both the variants. Okay, and then the similar way we are going to assign the dependencies to these operations in the super routing as well. And finally, we are going to create a configuration profile for the material, which is the KMAT. So this configuration profile, it basically tells us, how the configuration screen should basically behave whenever the configuration, has been simulated or initiated in the sales order. So here is a simple scenario that we are going to execute in SAP now. So from this slide, this particular finished product, the bike, this is going to be the VC material or the KMAT material, which is my finished product or the saleable material. So under this bike, I have provided 4 options to the customer, 4 basic options. The first one is the model of the bike. Should it be a flexi gear or a standard gear? And then the suspension, and then the saddle or seat. So under the flexi gear, so let's say the customer has selected flexi gear. Under flexi gear, I have provided again 3 more options. One is the sports model, which has a gear ratio of 10:4, and then the hybrid model, which has a gear ratio of 7:3, and then the city model, which has a gear ratio of 6:2. And similarly, the standard gear option can also have the city gear ratio, which is 6:2. And again, this is just some random values over here. And similarly, if we come to the suspension, we are going to provide 3 types of suspensions. One is the mono, and then we have the flexible suspension, and then the hydraulic suspension. And coming to the saddle, we have 3 variants again, 3 options. Does he need the heavy seats, or the medium seats, or the plush seats? So the customer has got these options where he can basically choose while he is going to raise a purchase order to us. So once we receive the purchase order from the customer, we are going to enter that into the SAP system in the form of a sales order, right? So that is where these options will pop up, where the user is going to choose from these corresponding characteristic values. So if we term this into SAP, this is our finished product, and this is our characteristic, and these are our characteristic values. Okay, so now let's get into SAP. Okay, so here I am in SAP. So I have created the material as a bike. So if I go into the screen of the basic data, from here you can see that the material type is a configurable material, which has the material type as KMAT. Okay, and then we have assigned the basic data there. And now, since we have picked the material type as KMAT, you should always have the checkbox for the material is configurable field. So only if we have this activated, that is where the system is going to know that this is a configurable material. So once we assign these values in the basic data, and then we are going into the classification view, where the class type, it should be as a 300 as a variant, right? So select the class, and now here I have assigned the class as a bike type. So this is the class where I have assigned these characteristics, like the model of the bike, the gear ratio, this suspension type, and the type of seat. These are my characteristics, and this is my class. Okay, and if I just come out of the classification view, so now going into the sales view. So here I have configured this in the plant, the sales org, and the distribution channel. Yeah, so here we do not have anything in specific. Yeah, so here one thing to look at is the item category group. You should always make sure that you have the item category group as 0002. That is enabled for the variant configuration scenario. So coming to the material master standpoint, these are the basic steps that we are going to assign in the material. And now let's go to the class. I'm going to CL03, and now my class is bike type. And if we go into the characteristics, we have created these characteristics like the model, the gear ratio, suspension, and the seat. And now if I go into the details of these characteristics, let's say the model first. So yeah, this is the characteristic model. And now if I go into the values, I have assigned 2 values, FG and SG. FG is basically to select the flexi gear model or the cycle, and the SG value stands for the standard gear cycle. Okay, and similarly, if I go to the other characteristic, the gear ratio, and look at the values. So here the values I have assigned is 7:3 for the hybrid gear ratio, and 10:4 for the sports, and 6:2 for the city. Okay, so these are the characteristics values that we are going to expect to be enabled while configuring the material in the sales order. Okay, and then to the suspension. So these are the 4 types: mono, flexi, hydraulic, and adjustable hydraulic. And then the saddle or the seat. In the seats, we have the mountain, which has the heavy cushion, and then the touring, and then the road. So for these options, we have assigned the description as such. So now we have created these characteristics and then assigned it to the class, and the class has been assigned to the finished product or the KMAT material, which is the bike in our case. And now we are going to the bill of material. So this is the super bomb. The transaction that we use here is again CS01, right? And yeah, you can see here I have assigned the component list, which includes both the models. It includes the flexi gear, the standard gear, hybrid gear, sports gear, city gear, and also all 4 types of suspensions and the other 3 types of seats, right? So I have included all the components together. And here you have a field for the that shows as OD, which means that the object dependency exists for this. So before going to this, I'm going to open the object dependency or the dependency screen. So let me go to CU03, and the dependencies, let me choose, let's say I'm going to pick the gear ratio hybrid. Okay, so this is the dependency what I have created in CU01. So now we are in the display mode of it, and here I have selected the dependency type as a selection condition, right? It means that to whichever component this particular dependency has been assigned, that should be enabled based on the selection condition for that component. Okay, and now here in the dependency editor, we are going to write a code. So you should always make sure that the syntax is followed properly. So here the gear ratio, the GR basically stands for the gear ratio, and the model is basically hybrid. Okay, so it starts with dollar as a symbol and then parent dot, and then it follows the characteristic of that particular gear ratio. Okay, so if I go to the other screen just to show you the characteristics. So here my characteristic is a gear ratio, right? So I have entered that over along with the code here. So it starts with dollar parent dot the characteristic equal to the value. So which means that the hybrid model selection should happen only if the gear ratio value has been selected as 7:3, right? So here in the gear ratio, we have the values 7:3, 10:4, and 6:2. So the hybrid basically belongs to the gear ratio 7:3, right? That's the reason I have created the dependency to choose the hybrid kind of a gear ratio. So for that, I need to tell system that whenever you choose this value as 7:3, this is the component you have to pick from the bill of material. So here is where we basically create that kind of a relationship. So here we have the characteristic again, and then the value. And so I'm also assigning another condition saying that, and the model is equal to FG. So what is the model here? Going back to this characteristic. In the model characteristic, we have the value FG as a flexi gear, right? Which means that this particular hybrid gear ratio should be selected or maybe picked from the BOM only if the gear ratio has been selected to be 7:3 and the parent model is a flexi gear model. So this hybrid model should not be picked if it is a standard gear, right? So that is what we are trying to tell the system here. And similarly, if I open another relationship, dependency, let's take suspension. So this is a dependency for the suspension. And again, this is going to be a selection condition. And if I go to the editor, it again starts with $parent dot, and then you have the characteristic as suspension. So if we go back to the characteristics, suspension, here I have the values as mono. Mono, it basically stands for the mono suspension, right? If the selection is as mono and the parent model is SG, so the parent model is now going to be a standard gear and the suspension type should be as mono. Only in that case, this particular selection condition should work and the corresponding component should be considered into the bill of material. Okay. So that is what has been configured in this, or maybe created in the dependency.